What do you think God is asking you to leave behind in order to step into His promises? How can you trust God's leading in your life, even when the path seems uncertain? Share your thoughts below and join the conversation as we explore faith and obedience together. In today's video, we will dive into one of the most profound moments in Abraham's life, a moment that's often overlooked but holds deep spiritual significance. Why did God call Abraham to separate from his father Terah, and how did this act of obedience shape the course of Abraham's faith and the destiny of God's people? Let's explore the powerful reasons behind this separation. We'll explore the story of Terah, Abraham's father, and uncover why God had to step in and remove Abraham from his father's influence. We'll also examine how this separation wasn't just physical, but deeply spiritual, laying the foundation for Abraham's covenant with God. Stay tuned as we uncover how this pivotal moment in history impacts our understanding of faith and obedience today. 1. Understanding Terah, the idolater. Father. Terah's story is often overlooked in the Bible, but it holds the key to understanding why God had to separate Abraham from his father. Terah was not just the father of Abraham. He was a man deeply rooted in the idolatry of his time. Terah lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, an ancient and prosperous city that was spiritually corrupt. While the city flourished economically, it was filled with the worship of idols, particularly the worship of celestial bodies, including the moon god Sin. This city's idolatry wasn't a private affair. It was institutionalized, and the people lived in a culture that exalted false gods. In Genesis 11:26-32, we learn about Terah's family. He had 3 sons, Abram, later called Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. While the Bible doesn't give much detail about Terah's personal faith, it's clear that he was an idolater, and his influence on Abraham was significant. Terah didn't just pass down material wealth, he passed down the cultural and spiritual practices of idolatry. This is crucial because it shows the kind of environment that Abraham grew up in, one that was spiritually polluted and tied to false beliefs. But why did this matter so much to God? Why was it so important for God to separate Abraham from Terah's influence? The answer lies in God's plan to create a holy nation. For Abraham to become the father of a nation set apart for God's purposes, he had to be separated from the very environment that nourished spiritual compromise. God had a divine promise for Abraham, one that required a complete break from the idolatry and sin of his father's house. Imagine growing up in a household where every influence, every tradition, and every practice revolved around worshiping things other than God. That was the environment Abraham found himself in. Terah's spiritual blindness, his attachment to idols, and his complacency in the midst of a corrupt culture would have hindered Abraham's ability to step fully into God's promises. The separation wasn't just a physical move. It was a spiritual cleansing, a necessary break from everything that stood in the way of Abraham's destiny. God knew that for Abraham to fully embrace his covenant, he had to break free from Terah's legacy. The first step of this journey was not just to leave his homeland, but to break away from everything tied to idolatry. It was a step of obedience, a moment of spiritual clarity, where Abraham had to choose God over the idols his father worshipped. Terah's influence was a weight that Abraham could not carry into the future God had for him. This spiritual separation wasn't just about moving away from a physical place. It was about moving away from the old spiritual systems that had shaped Abraham's life up until that point. God's call to Abraham was clear. Leave your father's house, your land, and your kindred, and go to the land that I will show you. This wasn't just a call to step out of a geographic location. It was a call to step out of idolatry and into God's purpose. Abraham had to leave behind the familiar, the comfortable, and the traditions of his father to walk into the unknown with God. For us, the story of Terah and Abraham is a powerful reminder that sometimes spiritual growth requires a clean break from the past. Just as Abraham had to leave behind his father's idolatry, we too may need to separate ourselves from influences in our lives that keep us from fully trusting God. Whether it's family traditions, cultural norms, or personal habits, anything that hinders our walk with God must be left behind. The separation was painful, but necessary. It wasn't about rejecting his father, but about rejecting the idols that held Abraham captive spiritually. Abraham's journey started not with a promise, but with a break from the past, a spiritual shift that would set the foundation for God's covenant to unfold in his life. As we reflect on Terah's role in this story, it becomes clear that sometimes God calls us to leave behind the familiar, even the things we've known and loved, for something far greater. And in that separation, God begins to shape us for the future he has planned. It's in that moment of obedience, when we leave behind what's holding us back, that God can work in us and through us in powerful ways. 2. Terah's interrupted journey. In Genesis 11:31, we see something intriguing about Terah's journey. It says, "Terah took Abram his son, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there." Notice the key detail. Terah, not Abraham, began the journey. God had called Abraham, but it was his father who initially set the course towards the promised land. However, the journey came to a halt in Haran. This wasn't just a geographical stop, it was a spiritual one. Terah's journey symbolizes a spiritual turning point, a journey that started with promise, but stopped short of fulfillment. Why did he stop in Haran? The text doesn't provide a clear reason, but we can infer that it had to do with his attachments to the old ways, his unresolved spiritual ties, and perhaps his comfort in what he knew. Haran, like Ur, was a city steeped in idolatry and worldly influence. It was a place where Terah could settle comfortably without confronting the radical faith that Abraham would have to embrace. By stopping in Haran, Terah chose to remain in a space that allowed him to hold on to the old spiritual practices, rather than fully embrace God's call to leave behind the past and move forward. This interruption wasn't just a mere delay. Spiritually, it reflected Terah's unwillingness to completely sever ties with the old life. He had taken the first steps of obedience, but his heart wasn't fully committed. The distance between Ur and Haran wasn't just physical. It represented the internal struggle Terah faced in letting go of the past and trusting God for what lay ahead. In contrast, God's call to Abraham was clear and non-negotiable. The command was to leave everything behind: his land, his kindred, and his father's house. It wasn't just about geography. It was about a complete break from a past that couldn't be carried into the future God had prepared for him. Abraham, unlike his father, was willing to take the full step of obedience. Terah's story serves as a warning for us. Sometimes we begin a journey of faith, but we hesitate when it gets uncomfortable. We settle in Haran, not realizing that spiritual progress requires more than just a halfway commitment. True obedience calls us to move beyond our comfort zones and leave behind the spiritual baggage that could hinder our relationship with God. Abraham's path would only begin in earnest when he fully left Haran behind, just as we are called to step away from anything that could hold us back from the full blessing of God. 3. God's call to Abraham, a new beginning. In Genesis 12:1, we find one of the most pivotal moments in the Bible. "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee." This command was not just about moving physically from one place to another. It was God calling Abraham to a whole new level of obedience, faith, and spiritual transformation. At this point, Abraham had already left Ur with his father Terah, but that journey was incomplete. There was a part of the journey that only Abraham could make. The moment Terah died, the weight of idolatry and the pull of old habits was fully cut off from Abraham's life. The separation wasn't just geographical, it was spiritual. God's call was a declaration that Abraham needed to leave behind everything associated with his past: his land, his family, and most significantly, his father's house. Why was it so crucial for Abraham to leave his father's house? This wasn't just about physical separation. It was about leaving the influences that could spiritually block God's plan for him. Terah, as we saw earlier, was an idolater. He lived in a city full of idol worship where gods like the moon god, Sin, were revered. Abraham, however, was called to serve the one true God. to walk in God's promises, Abraham had to leave behind the spiritual baggage that would hinder his relationship with God. This command was radical. God wasn't asking Abraham to just go somewhere new. He was asking him to take a step of faith into the unknown. Abraham didn't know where the land would be, only that God would show him. He was asked to trust God's direction fully, to go without knowing the destination. This is the essence of faith, taking a step into the unknown, trusting that God will guide us even when we don't have the full picture. This is the moment where faith is tested. Leaving his father's house meant leaving behind his past, his culture, his security, and his connections. It was an act of complete obedience. God didn't just ask Abraham to move. He asked him to sever ties with everything that could spiritually weigh him down. This was God's way of purifying Abraham, preparing him to be the father of a new nation, a nation that would be set apart for God's purposes. For us today, God still calls us to make similar separations in our lives. Like Abraham, we may be asked to step away from the past, from relationships, or from mindsets that don't align with God's will. These separations are not about rejecting people or places, but about choosing God's path over the distractions of the world. Just as Abraham's obedience made room for God's blessing, our obedience allows God to work in our lives in ways we can't fully comprehend. Abraham's story isn't just about one man's journey. It's about every believer's journey. We all face moments where God asks us to leave behind the familiar and the comfortable to follow Him into the unknown. This isn't easy, but it's in these moments of obedience that we experience God's faithfulness in ways we never imagined. God promised Abraham that He would make him a great nation, bless him, and make His name great. But all of these blessings came after Abraham's obedience. Before Abraham could receive the promises, he had to separate himself from everything that could interfere with God's purpose. This lesson is clear. God's promises require obedience, and obedience requires separation from the things that would keep us from walking in His will. Abraham's journey, just like ours, began with a choice. God's call was not a suggestion, it was a command. And Abraham's response wasn't just about physical movement, but about spiritual transformation. It was an invitation to trust in God fully, to embrace the unknown with the confidence that God would provide and lead. Just as Abraham stepped out in faith, we too are called to trust God, leave behind the old, and embrace the new. What steps is God asking you to take today? Where do you need to separate yourself to walk into the promises God has for you? 4. The legacy of idolatry and Abraham's faith. In Joshua 24:2 it says, "And Joshua said unto all the people, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nachor, and they served other gods." This verse reveals a crucial truth. Terah, Abraham's father, was an idolater. He lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, a place steeped in idol worship, specifically worshiping celestial bodies like the moon god, Sin. This is important because it reveals the spiritual backdrop against which Abraham's faith emerged. God's call to Abraham wasn't just to move geographically, it was to separate himself from a life of idolatry that had been handed down through his family. Idolatry wasn't just a practice for Terah, it was a spiritual inheritance. This inheritance was tied to the old world, to false gods, and to a way of living that sought security in things created by human hands, rather than in the Creator Himself. For Abraham to truly follow God, he needed to break away from the influence of idolatry. The idols represented everything that opposed God's sovereignty. They were visible, tangible, and man-made, whereas the God Abraham was called to serve was invisible, eternal, and omnipotent. The call to leave his father's house was, therefore, a call to leave behind not only physical ties but also the spiritual darkness of idolatry. We too face similar spiritual struggles today. The world around us is full of idols. It may not be physical statues we bow down to, but many of us still worship false gods, whether it's money, success, approval, or comfort. These idols promise security and fulfillment, but like the idols of old, they leave us empty. God calls us, like Abraham, to separate ourselves from these distractions, to turn our eyes fully toward Him, and to trust in His promises. Abraham's willingness to leave his father's house, to break with the idolatrous culture that shaped him, was a radical act of faith. He was walking away from a life of familiarity, a life that was rooted in tradition, and stepping into the unknown with God as his guide. This was not just a physical journey, it was a spiritual one, where Abraham had to choose a new way of life, one where God was the center, not idols. Abraham's faith was a bold declaration that he believed in the one true God and that he would trust his leading, even when it meant breaking with the past. His faith was not perfect, and it was a journey with many challenges, but it was a faith that was anchored in obedience to God's call. The lesson we learn from Abraham's story is that faith requires action. True faith isn't just about believing, it's about living out that belief by making choices that honor God. For Abraham, that meant stepping away from his father's idolatry and embracing a life of complete trust in God's promise. In the same way, we are called to leave behind anything that might hinder our relationship with God, even if it's a part of our past or our culture. Abraham's obedience set the stage for the fulfillment of God's promises. He became the father of a great nation, Israel, and through him, all the nations of the earth were blessed. His story is a reminder that God can and will use ordinary people to accomplish his extraordinary purposes. But we must be willing to let go of the things that bind us to the old world and embrace the new life he offers. For us today, the question is, what are the idols in our own lives? What is God calling us to leave behind in order to fully embrace his promises? Just as God called Abraham out of idolatry, he is calling us to step out of the shadows of false gods and walk in the light of his truth. 5. Abraham's faithful obedience. In Hebrews 11:8 it says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went." This verse captures the essence of Abraham's faith. God called Abraham to leave his father's house and go to a land he would show him, but Abraham didn't have the full picture. He didn't know exactly where he was going, yet he trusted God and obeyed. This is a powerful example of faith that requires both trust and action. Abraham's obedience wasn't just a simple decision, it was a radical step. He left behind everything he knew, his family, his homeland, and the security of his past. He chose to walk into the unknown, trusting that God would lead him. This is a profound example of what it means to live by faith. God didn't tell Abraham all the details, he simply asked for obedience, and Abraham responded in faith. Abraham's obedience was significant not only because of the physical journey he took, but because it reflected a deep spiritual transformation. He was leaving behind the idolatry of his father's house, stepping out of the shadows of a past rooted in false worship, and choosing to follow the one true God. This wasn't just a physical journey to a new land. It was a spiritual journey to a new life, one that was marked by trust and obedience to God's call. For Abraham, faith wasn't just about believing, it was about doing. He could have chosen to stay in Haran, just like his father Terah, who stopped his journey halfway. But Abraham didn't settle for almost. He didn't stop before reaching the promise. He went all the way, fully trusting in God's plan, even though he didn't know the end result. Abraham's obedience is a model for us today. Like Abraham, we are often called to take steps of faith without knowing the full picture. God doesn't always reveal every detail of his plan, but he calls us to trust him. We may not know where the road will lead, but if we obey, we can trust that God will guide us every step of the way. Abraham's faith teaches us that the journey of obedience is one of trust and surrender. It's not always easy, but it's the path to God's promises. In our own lives, we may be called to step out in faith, to leave behind old habits, relationships, or mindsets. Just as Abraham was called to leave his father's house, we too may need to leave behind what holds us back from fully following God. It may be a comfort zone, a familiar situation, or even a certain way of thinking. But true faith requires us to follow God's leading, even when we don't understand the full plan. Abraham's story reminds us that faith is not just about belief, but about action. When God calls, we must respond in obedience, trusting that he knows what's best. Abraham didn't hesitate. He didn't question God's plan, he simply obeyed, and through his obedience, God's promise was fulfilled. Abraham's obedience set the stage for God's covenant with him. Through his faithfulness, God promised to make him the father of many nations. This promise would later be fulfilled in the birth of Isaac and the establishment of Israel as a nation. But it all started with Abraham's obedient step of faith. For us today, the question is, are we willing to take that step of faith? Are we ready to leave behind what holds us back and follow God's call, even when we don't have all the answers? Abraham's story shows us that faith and obedience go hand in hand. We are called to trust God and obey his commands, knowing that he is faithful to fulfill his promises. Abraham's faith was not just a one-time act, it was a lifelong journey of trust and obedience. It's a journey that continues to inspire us today, teaching us that God's promises are worth the steps of faith we take to follow him. 6. The significance of the separation. In Genesis 12, 1-3, God gives Abraham a clear command. Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. This command is not just a physical separation, but a profound spiritual one. The significance of Abraham's separation from his father, Terah, goes beyond geography. It's a transformative act that sets the foundation for God's covenant with Abraham and the entire nation of Israel. God knew that Abraham's calling required more than just leaving his father's house. It required leaving the spiritual influence of Terah. Terah, who had served other gods, had created a spiritual environment for Abraham that was rooted in idolatry and false worship. Abraham needed to break free from this environment to fully embrace the covenant God was offering. This wasn't just about Abraham leaving a place. It was about him leaving behind everything that could hinder his spiritual growth and obedience to God. The separation from Terah symbolizes God's purifying work in Abraham's life. God was calling Abraham to step out of the old and into the new, to break away from the influence of idolatry and step into a relationship with the one true God. It's as though God was saying, you cannot move forward into the promises I have for you until you leave behind the spiritual baggage that holds you back. This is a pivotal moment in Abraham's journey, a moment of spiritual cleansing and preparation for the blessings that were to come. The separation was also a necessary step for Abraham to fulfill his role as the father of a holy nation. The nation of Israel was to be set apart, distinct from the other nations that worshipped false gods. For this to happen, Abraham needed to be set apart as well. The promise of a land, a lineage, and a blessing could not be realized while Abraham was still tied to the past, to the idolatry and traditions of his father's house. The old had to pass away, and the new had to be established. For us, the story of Abraham's separation is a powerful reminder that sometimes, to fully follow God's call, we must be willing to leave behind things that hinder our spiritual growth. This may include relationships, habits, or even certain ways of thinking that are rooted in the past and not aligned with God's will. Just as Abraham had to leave the spiritual environment of his father's house, we too may need to step away from influences that keep us from fully embracing God's plan for our lives. The separation from Terah was not a rejection of Abraham's father as a person, but a necessary break from the spiritual environment that could not support God's covenant. It was about God calling Abraham to a new level of faith, where obedience and trust in God would define his journey. It was about moving from the shadow of his father's idolatry into the light of God's promises. The journey that Abraham was about to embark on was not going to be easy. It required faith, trust, and a willingness to leave behind the familiar. But it was the only way for Abraham to experience the fullness of God's blessings. God knew that for Abraham to become the father of many nations, he needed to be completely surrendered to God's will, free from the spiritual constraints of his past. Abraham's story challenges us today. What do we need to leave behind in order to fully embrace God's call on our lives? What idols, traditions, or influences do we need to separate ourselves from in order to walk in obedience to God's plan? Just as God separated Abraham from Terah's influence, he calls us to separate ourselves from anything that might keep us from experiencing his fullness. In conclusion, the significance of the separation between Abraham and Terah goes far beyond physical distance. It is a profound spiritual act that marks the beginning of Abraham's journey into God's promises. It shows us that sometimes, in order to move forward in our faith, we must be willing to let go of the past and step into the new thing that God is doing in our lives. Conclusion. The separation between Abraham and Terah is a powerful spiritual lesson that resonates with us today. It wasn't just about moving from one place to another. It was about leaving behind the old, the spiritually stagnant, and stepping into a new chapter of obedience to God's call. Abraham's journey began with a radical act of faith and trust, one that required him to break free from his father's idolatrous influence in order to fully embrace the promises God had for him. This story invites us to reflect on our own lives. Are there areas where we need to separate ourselves from influences that hinder our spiritual growth? Just as Abraham was called to leave behind the familiar, we too may be called to step out of our comfort zones and follow God's lead, even when we don't fully understand where it will take us. Abraham's obedience resulted in the fulfillment of God's promises, and the same can happen in our lives. When we step away from the things holding us back, we make room for God's blessings, His guidance, and His plan to unfold. Abraham's story is a testimony to the power of faith, the importance of spiritual obedience, and the transformative journey that God calls each of us to embark on. As we reflect on Abraham's faith, let it inspire us to take steps of obedience in our own lives, trusting that when we leave behind what we need to, God will lead us into a future filled with His promises. Our journey may not always be easy, but just as God was with Abraham, He promises to be with us every step of the way.